And this is something I really wanted to get your take on, Kyle, right? Obviously, we've got some big news about how the Justice Democrats have been kind of performing in this cycle as far as fundraising goes and staffing. But we talk about how the Democratic voters and the base that we have to reach, right? There's no two ways about it. You cannot run an outsider candidacy without the Democratic Party base. This is something that Bernie Sanders understood through all his faults, right? You have to be able to reach those voters because they make up so much of the pie that you have to win. And those people really value credibility, right? They do not like it if you come out and you haven't had any experience, right? Their favorite thing to hammer Trump for was the fact that he had no experience for the job, right? They were like, would you let a doctor do surgery on you if they had no medical degree? Would you be represented by a lawyer that, didn't go to law school, et cetera? That was like their favorite burn on the guy, which, as Gavin just pointed out, the Republicans did not care at all about, but the Democrats did. So what did we do as, progressives who want to earn those Democrats' voters, but also change their perception of what's possible through politics? We were like, let's knock down the House. 2018, you were, one of the chief thought leaders on that, Kyle. Let's get people like AOC. Let's get people like Cori Bush into the halls of Congress, and let's let them, earn the respectability of the mainstream Democrats while they still respect us. You can't deny their credentials. They've been serving, in Congress. They've cast votes on, X and Y issues. They've put their foot down. They protested outside Nancy Pelosi's office, whatever, right? These are credentialed people. But what happened? They were swallowed up by the swamp, right? The snake ate its own tail. And now through the process of getting them to the point where they were now respected and taken seriously, now they no longer are interested in representing the people. They're far more interested in, getting reelected. They're far more caught in the monotony. And I'm not even saying that this is like a character weakness per se. It's the design. It's the mechanism of the system. So I would just, be curious what your thoughts are. Like, what's the next strategy? Like, what's the next curveball to throw to try and, break this up?
I mean, first, let's diagnose what the problem is, which is, so when we started Justice Democrats, we did a lot of the vetting was around policy stuff, because we're policy people. We have a clear idea of, what we want implemented, and we feel like it represents the American people. We want Medicare for all. We want free college. We want a living wage. We want stronger unions. We want to end the wars. We know what we want. And so when we did Justice Democrats, we vetted a lot for, are you with us on the policies? Are you with us on the policies? And if somebody was, and they passed that test, then it's like, okay, you'll be the person, right? And in the case of, like, say, Paula Jean Swearengin in West Virginia, good person, but just wasn't a dynamic enough politician to win. Didn't even come close, right? And so there's other factors that are important too. I mean, charisma is one, just in terms of, like, can you get people to give a shit about what you're saying? And can you get people to want to cast a ballot for you? And, charisma's not all that common. But the most important thing that we were missing was, and it's hard to test for this. In fact, I don't even know how we can, but it's leadership qualities. Like, do you have somebody who's not only correct on the policies and charismatic and likable, but they're leaders and they know when to draw a line in the sand and say, fuck you, no, right? And that's, I feel like, the biggest hurdle when it comes to Justice Democrats, and that's one of the reasons, to your point, they had to lay off like half their staff. They're not doing all that hot, and it's like, well, you guys decided at some point that it makes more sense to go along to get along and play the game from within and try to, like, get concessions by politicking behind the scenes, and you know what? You lost the main thing you had, which got you popular in the first place, was that you're an outsider with your microphone, the bully pulpit. Look how many followers AOC has on Twitter, right? She could get thousands of people in the streets just by saying, hey, we're going to fight on this particular issue. Come join me, right? And she doesn't do it because she doesn't want to do it, because she feels like, oh, I can get more concessions from within playing the game. Well, not only did you not get the concessions, now the founding group is sort of dwindling away into irrelevance and nothingness because you're acting more like insiders. Now, I'll add the caveat, which I think is important, which, many people overlook, which I think is unfair, which is, look, they are still sort of by a wide margin the closest we have to allies in there. For example, look at the Israel vote that just happened, what was it, yesterday or 2 days ago? There were like 9 votes against the resolution. The resolution was like, Israel isn't racist and is not an apartheid state, and we love them. That was like the resolution. And it was like mostly Justice Democrats who were like, fuck you, it is an apartheid state. We're not voting for this, right? And so they're still better in some clear ways. And I think it's important to point that out. But the scope is limited. They don't fight as much as we wanted them to fight. They don't show the leadership qualities. They're not harnessing that outsider energy anymore because they're really not outsiders anymore. And then it's like, of course it's going to, atrophy and become nothing. So, what's my answer as to how to fix this? I mean, I'm not exactly a genius here, but I would say you actually need to find people who are correct on the policies, not corrupted, charismatic, and also have leadership qualities where they're willing to take on a fight. Like I've seen no really good strategy. Anything that was good that Biden did, and he did do some good things, it's because Biden was sort of okay with doing these certain good things. He wasn't pushed to these things. You know what I mean?
But that's the thing, right, Kyle? Like, I mean, I would argue that you guys had one. I mean, and I'm biased, right? We're Missouri boys, proud and loud, right? We were so stoked. One of the first guests we ever got on our podcast when we had like 13 subscribers, guys, was Cori Bush, and this was in the second time she'd run. So this was 2020. She lost the first time around because she was running against a political dynasty in St. Louis. For people who didn't follow that race, but anyway, she was running again. And she came on and she chatted with us, and she was such a powerful leader in Ferguson. She had so much clout, and she was such a force when you heard her talking. And she told us to our face, she was like, "There's not a day that I will not be getting in front of every camera that will have me. That I will not sit in front of every media show because the people in my district have needs that are not being met, and I'm going to fight for them." And I can't picture a vetting process where I am sitting across from Cori Bush and she is lighting a fire under my ass, and I'm so inspired. But I watch how her and yeah, you're right. She cast a base vote on Israel. She was one of, I think, 9 Congress people, along with people like AOC, Jamal Bowman, and other familiar faces.
Talib leaned into it.
Yeah,
she has
Talib,
a Palestinian
Ilhan Omar. I think Ayanna Pressley voted for it. So there was a lot of good there. I'm not diminishing that, but do you kind of see what I'm saying?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Look, let me add one more criticism to them, because this is one I think people don't bring up nearly enough, which is, man, they got lost down that identity politics rabbit hole super fucking quickly. Where AOC was doing an Instagram live thing where she was like, people need to use Latinx or something. And it's like, what?
Yeah.
You're a congressperson, and this is what you're talking about? Really? Even the arguments that were in service of the correct position on the Israel vote, a lot of the language around it was like, you're just trying to shut up a woman of color.
Yep.
And it's like, no, that's not the response, because if I said the same shit that Pramila Jayapal said, they would still bring up that resolution. It's got nothing to do with the identity of Pramila Jayapal at all. It has to do with their serving the Israel lobby, and so they're sucking them off to try to get more campaign contributions, and they're saying, Israel's not racist, Israel's not apartheid. So even in service of the right position, they get lost in the identity politics world, which is never going to fucking work to make you popular and to make you a viable candidate on the national stage. Who is the Democratic president right now? Literally the least woke Democrat left in the country, Joe fucking Biden. He probably dropped a slur before lunch, okay? And so, listen, honestly, but I'm going to give you a little cherry on top of hope here, because I actually believe this to my core. Look at what they're doing in Minnesota right now. Tim Walz, the governor of Minnesota, is fucking based as shit, man. I covered on my channel a while ago. It was such an amazing story that I literally did like a weekend segment just talking into an iPhone, because I was like, I got to talk about this right now. They got free school lunch and free school breakfast for everybody in a universal sense. There was like 10 things on the list that were just like mega based that I was like, this guy's the fucking man. And he also was fighting as he was doing it. So anyway, my point here is, what seems to me to be the hope for the future more is those Midwestern Democrats who understand what issues are like, hey, I ain't touching that. That's nuanced. I got no interest in it. Versus they're all in on the economic populism. And let me tell you something, that is going to win elections. And it's going to win elections easily, because people look at you as, oh, that's the serious person who just raised my wages. I like them. right? And that's not me saying give up on the social issues, because social issues are super important. And the drug war, we see the assault that's happening right now on the LGBTQ community. We see the assault that's happening on abortion rights. So I'm definitely not saying disarm on social issues. In fact, you better play good defense and you better protect the LGBTQ community. You better protect abortion rights. But where they put the emphasis is on the broad things that gets everybody to love them and vote for them. And so I think Tim Walz in Minnesota, a lot of these Midwestern Democrats are really the ones who are leading the way. I mean, look at, Sherrod Brown. He's not nearly as good as Tim Walz is, but he's like a very pro-union Democratic senator in Ohio. Ohio has been going mega red for like 3 or 4 election cycles, and Sherrod Brown still wins comfortably over there, right?
Right.
So that's where it's at.
Yeah, totally. And by the way, speaking of Tim Walz, the governor of Minnesota, earlier in the show I mentioned Jesse Ventura. Actually, did you know that Jesse Ventura broke his long running tradition of not endorsing duopoly candidates in order to actually endorse Governor Tim Walz for his most recent run?
Because he's based.
He's based. He's in favor of legal cannabis. He has all these great policies. And Ventura was like, I actually feel like it is worth endorsing a Democrat despite, going my entire political career preaching against Democrats and Republicans. So yeah, that definitely caught my eye, and I have been paying attention to some of what Tim Walz is doing. I think he's a really, really good governor and a great model for how to run in a state like Minnesota, which obviously is not, California or New York. I tend to agree with that analysis, Kyle. Going back to Justice Democrats real quick, there's one point I wanted to make about their strategy, and I think why so much of the support for them has atrophied. So they were honestly just coattail riders, in my opinion, in large part of the Bernie Sanders movement. And the reason I say that is because they were betting on Bernie Sanders winning the nomination. And when that didn't happen, they took it as an excuse to give up and go home and stop fighting. When, in my opinion, and I've said this a million times on the Vanguard, Bernie Sanders losing the nomination to Joe Biden was not an excuse to stop fighting and stop aggressively resisting the Democratic establishment. That was when the fight actually really got real. That's when you need to double down. That's when you need to get 5 times more aggressive against the Democratic establishment and say, okay, well, if you're going to put up this fucking guy, then I'm going to have to be the most aggressive left flank thorn in your motherfucking side for the next 4 years. And they've chosen the exact opposite path. Honestly, it's crazy to me that they, cosplayed as these revolutionaries. But then when their candidate lost and the establishment won, that's when you give up? Like, no, that's when you actually start fighting, right?
Yeah.
You agree with that?
Absolutely. And Bernie is actually fighting Biden more, even though he's
Way
personally friends with Biden than a lot of these other ones are. A good example of that is he's holding up some nomination for some position. I'm blanking on what position it is, until Biden lowers prescription drug prices, which Biden has the authority to do on his own under the Biden-Dole Act, because under that act, anything that that taxpayer money, government money, goes towards the research and development of these drugs. So any drug created with that kind of money, you can lower it on your own. You have the authority to do it. Basically, price controls from the executive branch, because we've invested so much taxpayer money into this. And so Bernie's actually fighting him on that. And I look at that and I'm like, first of all, thank you, based Bernie. I really appreciate that you're actually standing up and fighting on this issue. But beyond that, it's like, well, why isn't forget the Justice Democrats, why isn't every single Congressional Progressive Caucus member causing a stink about this, raising a stink about this? Biden, he would feel like his hand is forced if every single Congressional Progressive Caucus member was involved in a press conference and went on the Sunday shows and said, we're going to stand up to President Biden on this because he has the authority and he's not going to do it. And it's like, this is what we need. This is what we need. But we're not seeing enough of it, and that's why people feel dejected and they feel let down, and it is what it is at this point.
Yeah, but I can't, again, just not to beat a dead horse, but if not somebody like Cori Bush, like who? Who is it going to be? How do we find that person? And is it not just a power structure issue? Is it not just an issue where, hey, once you get into the walls of, into the halls of Congress or whatever you want to say, you're just, you're taken out.
That I flirted with that analysis from time to time, but fundamentally I don't believe it, because if you look at Tim Walz, he's a great counterexample. It's like, 5
But he's
years
not
ago.
in Congress. He's in his own. He's in his own governorship, and I feel like we've seen more renegade governors in our time, and that goes for good and bad governors, right, and everything in between. You've got Tim Walz, but you also have my childhood governor, Sam Brownback. Gavin and I, have many stories to tell about that guy. That guy, was a Republican, but he was on just like scorched earth. He literally bankrupted the entire state. You know what I mean? It's easier to, I feel like, go on your own path if you're a governor. Where have we seen that so much?
I think you're right. I think you're right that it's easier at the state level, particularly because there's not as much corrupting money at the state level, for example. There's not as much of a coherent party state structure that can sort of get in your way. But I don't agree with the idea that it's like just impossible, because there's always been renegades. I mean, Ron Paul's a renegade on the Republican side. He's super libertarian. He's principled. He's ideological. He has his philosophy, and he votes in accordance with that. Bernie Sanders, there was a reason. I remember when Hillary was like, this guy, nobody even likes this guy. He has no friends in Washington. And our reaction was like, that's based. We don't want him to have any friends in Washington. We want him because he's out there and he's casting the proper votes and he's fighting for it. He was called the Amendment King because he always slipped in these based things to pieces of legislation that were totally unrelated, because he felt like this is the only way I can win is if I do it this way. So there's Bernie, there's Ron Paul. I'm sure there's some examples today. I'm sure, there's 10, 20 different examples of people who have their particular pet issue where they've fought on it and won that I'm just unfamiliar with at the moment. I don't think it's impossible, but I agree with you that it is harder at the national level, particularly because of the corrupting influence of all that money, but also because the party structure is very ossified, and you have your leaders like the Nancy Pelosi's and the Mitch McConnells on the Republican side, and, the Joe Bidens or whatever. And like, people feel like there's a real authority structure here. And so I'm going to go along to get along and fit in where I can and try to like play ball the nice way.
Right.
So I think it's harder. I don't think it's impossible, though. I think that once people really start believing it truly is impossible to make the change, that's when they go full nihilistic, full doomerist. And that's something I've been fighting against a lot lately, because, the left really needs to sort of get its shit together and be more clear-eyed as opposed to just sulking endlessly. Because it is true that ever since Bernie Sanders' campaign went down, like, it's just been, everybody's been a mess. It's like a ragtag group of maladjusted weirdos who are like, who everybody has a different idea. You hate each other, you're slitting each other's throats, etc.
Right. And like I said, they took Biden's victory over Bernie as an excuse to give up, not to double down and fight harder, which is obviously what's called for if the leader of the party is Joe Biden and not a progressive. So I think that's just totally insane. Also, as far as the congressional example, Zach, we obviously have the example of the Tea Party, right? That's what a lot of people wanted the Justice Democrats to kind of do and kind of act like, being an actual left flank, just like how the Tea Party seriously was like the right flank in the Republican Party, and they held up legislation. They really were a thorn in the side of leadership.
Let me just point out,
didn't hate the Tea Party like they would hate leftists, though. Corporatists love Tea Parties because they're all about, tax cuts or whatever. I think it's a totally different ballgame when you start talking about things like, socializing medicine, Green New Deal, nationalizing industries, those kinds of deals.
But let me just point out that, like, my biggest issue with a lot of these people is strategy. Their biggest problem is strategy and going along to get along. Like, they still cuck themselves. Like, just to give one example, like, $15 minimum wage actually passed through the House of Representatives. It passed. And everybody who we wanted to vote for it voted for it. So, like, they're right, but it's just they don't know how to pull the strings the right way and go about it to get it so it actually becomes law. Right, which is why we get something like the IRA.
I just don't think they want to stick their necks out for it.
No, you seriously believe that, like, AOC knows how to fight? I don't think she knows how to fight. I think she both...
Yes, dude, what are you talking about? Bro, I guarantee you, Kyle, come on. Listen, you remember those clips that we used to see of her going viral in 2018 when she was calling out Joe Crowley? Do you remember those? And how, like, it would, like, fill you with joy? Do you remember that moment when we had so much hope for the progressive movement that we were like, wow, look at what Bernie Sanders inspired, right? Like, I do believe that she knows how to fight. I remember...
And
I
she
brought
crashed
it up earlier.
Nancy Pelosi's office. She went in there.
Exactly, dude. She stood out there. We were like, hell fucking yes, this lady is a badass. Like, I'll lay in front of a train for this woman. Like, she's the best thing that's ever happened to the movement. She knows how to fight.
The
dude.
difference
She's got
is
teeth.
That's the activist portion of it, which she knows how to do. I'm saying the procedural side of it, she has no idea how to do. No.
Oh, fair.
And I
fair.
think it's a mix of, like we've been talking about this whole time, sort of going along to get along. I'll make more change if I'm friendly with Biden and all this stuff. I think it's a mix of that with just no idea how to procedurally get these things done. Which, look, there's a grace period, right? Like, I'll grant you 6 months of not like, fuck, I ran into a brick wall. How do I fix this? But if you don't come up with some coherent sort of strategy that at least has a prayer of working in a year, 2 years, whatever, then I start to go, God damn it, like we bet on the wrong horse here. I'd much rather have Tim Walz in Congress.
Yeah, and there's the procedural side, and then there's also knowing how to use like your celebrity and your power as someone with a large Twitter following, as you mentioned, someone that is granted access to mainstream media spaces and given a huge microphone to the American people. And frankly, the Justice Democrats just don't act like the left flank that they should in that way either. They're not.
Yeah, they're not the left Tea Party. They're not. They're just not the left Tea Party.
Right. When AOC recently went on Pod Save America to endorse Joe Biden, I said, if you're going to endorse this guy, like, I get why you feel like you have to do that and why you're not, voting or endorsing like Marianne Williamson or Cornel West or whatever I would like you to do. I get why you have to do that. But what bothered me about it, and this is what bothers me about their attitude at large towards the establishment, is that in the process of endorsing him, she had to gaslight us in the process and act like, oh, yeah, well, he's actually done such a great job. She couldn't just say, well, unfortunately, I do think he's better than Donald Trump, therefore I'm going to cast a vote for him. She had to act like somehow he was actually adequate for a progressive movement, like he was a president that deserved the approval of the progressive movement, which is the exact opposite of how a left flank should act. Even if Joe Biden does deserve credit on some stuff, yeah, give him credit for that. But don't stop talking about the fact that he still hasn't federally legalized cannabis. He still hasn't freed nonviolent drug offenders. He hasn't even talked about a public option since becoming president, which he literally campaigned on. Like, why is she not bringing this stuff up every time she has a platform, every time she has a microphone? Because if you can't be effective procedurally and you're not going to fight in that way, well, that's, in my opinion, basically the only utility you do have is to be a loud and proud, aggressive progressive going on mainstream platforms and making the case for a progressive agenda and pointing out the failures of Joe Biden. AOC has a huge Twitter following. She at least was really popular and in touch with the youth. I don't know, maybe she squandered that by now, but I think it would be meaningful and it would pierce a lot of people's kind of bubbles that have been formed by mainstream media propaganda, and they would start realizing, oh yeah, why hasn't Joe Biden done that thing? He did say he would, reschedule cannabis. What happened to that? Why hasn't he done that?
Yeah, we debated Ro Khanna on this. We interviewed Ro Khanna. I think it was last week.
Great discussion.
And we, the point that Crystal and I landed on is like, look, we're not naive. We're not stupid. I get how it works once you're inside the belly of the beast. I think everybody to some extent intuitively understands, oh, it's different once you're in the belly of the beast. We all get that. But you couldn't even bring yourself to a point where you stay out, where you just don't say anything. You think Joe Biden is waking up and scrolling the news every morning? I sure hope Ro Khanna endorsed me today, right? It's like, no, you could have just said nothing. If you said nothing, that would have been a million times better than endorsing Joe Biden this early when there is a candidate running who 95% of her platform is like Bernie Sanders. And then in some other areas, she might even be better than him. And you supported Bernie knowing he's way better than Biden. And now all of a sudden it's you hop on the bandwagon for Joe Biden. So it's just, look, that it's inexcusable. It just goes to show you're always going to need outsiders. You're always going to need activists. You're always going to need basically to try to hold these people accountable. But an ideal scenario would be, when we get somebody who you feel like, no, they're actually on our team and they're actually fighting for the things that we want and the things that we believe in, because that's when you see a real unified left and you all understand, okay, the common enemy is the right and we're all on the good side, you're the left. It would be a lot nicer and the world would be a lot simpler if we could get back to that sort of narrative where we feel like, again, I hate to keep bringing him up. I don't really, because I kind of love this guy, but Tim Walz is a great example of it. I know that dude is doing base things and his heart is in the right place. And so now I'm playing defense for you like a pit bull dog. If anybody comes for you, I'm going to come for them 10 times harder, right? I would like to be in that position with a lot of these congressional progressives, but we're just not there. And obviously it's very frustrating.